Thank you so much. The next element of the program allows me to introduce some of the most distinguished researchers whose work really bridges the MIT Center for Real Estate and the Sloan School of Management. These particular individuals have not only advanced the frontier of real estate research, but have also shaped the very foundation of how we understand markets, finance, and urban economics. First, we'll have Walt Torous, who's the director of the MIT Center for Real Estate's program, who also has a joint appointment between the Center and MIT Sloan, and is recognized as one of the nation's leading scholars in real estate finance. Next, we'll have Professor Chris Palmer, an associate professor of finance at Sloan, who brings a dynamic perspective to the study of real estate and financial markets. And then finally, last but not least, the ever-present Professor Bill Wheaton, one of the founders and former director of the Center for Real Estate, who is truly the pioneer of urban economics and has really set the standard for integrating economic theory within the real estate practice. So please join me in, first of all, welcoming Walt Torous to the stand. Thank you.
Oh, okay, my slides are up. All right, well, thank you for that very warm welcome, James. And yeah, my talk is going to be a little bit different from what we had before, so I hope you find it somewhat entertaining. And you know, I did prepare this short talk in the hope that you would find this as, if you will, an interesting topic where we sort of talk about how one can use artificial intelligence in the field of commercial real estate. And don't worry, I'm not going to do too much of a technical talk. I'll try to emphasize, if you will, the intuition behind what we're doing here. But speaking of technical, I should give a shout out, and you can see it in the little footnote there. Richard G, who's a current student in our master's program, who helped me with a lot of the sort of implementation of what I end up doing here. And I mention his name only because I think it's important that if there are any technical issues that I can't answer, Richard can certainly be able to answer them for me. And one thing I wanted to sort of emphasize at the outset is basically, I want to emphasize that, many of the concepts I'm going to talk about in my talk are going to be rooted in concepts that you hopefully have sort of fond memories of as graduate students. So I'm going to try and sort of really sort of focus and sort of make use of your past days as a graduate student here to sort of propel this little talk here. All right. So let's see what, I'm usually very bad with this. All right. So again, I'm going to start off. I want you to recall the Gordon model. Okay. So again, go back to classes with Todd or David Geltner, and I'm sure you have warm remembrances of the Gordon model. Okay. And the Gordon model basically says, well, here's the value of any particular asset, and we can arrive at that value by taking the asset's cash flow next period and capitalizing it by, if you will, R minus G. Remember, R is, if you will, this expected rate of return on the asset, which is assumed to be constant. And then there's this growth rate, right? And it's a constant growth rate, and it's assumed to be a growth rate forever. Okay? And then you put everything together and you get the value of this particular asset. Okay? Well, if you take that definition, okay, and just rewrite it a little bit, you can then come up with the asset's cash flow yield. Okay? So simply take the cash flow next period, divide it by its value, so you get the cash flow per unit of value, and that corresponds to R minus G. And this should be, very familiar in the world of real estate finance, because in commercial real estate, if you will, we identify the building's cash flow as its net operating income, or sometimes its net cash flow. And if you will, the resultant ratio is the building's cap of the cap rate associated with that particular building. And so this is sort of very standard, if you will, sort of real estate finance, and if you will, the Gordon growth model, which hopefully I've rekindled warm memories of. All right. All right. But there are problems with the Gordon model. Okay. So I point out sort of in the first two bullet points. One, I think there's been a lot of research done for example, in the world of finance that sort of has established without a doubt that expected rates of return, which are assumed to be constant in the traditional Gordon model, well, they're not really constant. You know, they vary over time and they vary with macroeconomic conditions, et cetera. Okay. And also, I'm sure as everyone knows in this particular audience, growth rates of net operating income are not constant. Right? They vary sometimes unpredictably. Okay. Well, that really throws a monkey wrench behind the Gordon model because this present value relation between the value, say, of a property or an asset and expected returns becomes really nonlinear. And we've come with some solutions to that problem, and that solution is sort of now dubbed not the traditional Gordon growth model, but the dynamic Gordon growth model. And this goes back to work by John Campbell and Robert Shiller. And the idea is to sort of, well, let's approximate this non-linear relationship. And I'm not going to bother you with the math here, but remember with the traditional Gordon model, the cap rate corresponded to R minus G. Well, with the sort of the dynamic Gordon model, you still have this relationship between R and G, but okay, the R then is replaced by the present value of expected future returns, and the G is replaced by the present value of expected future NOI growth. And the intuition, sort of in terms of sort of trying to understand what the dynamic Gordon model says, well, the effect on cap rates of, say, if you had very high NOI growth or low discount rates, which, you know, in the traditional Gordon model says, well, boom, you're going to get, you know, basically lower cap rates, higher values. Now, if you will, that effect depends on, well, how long do you expect NOI growth rates to be, if you will, high, or how long do you expect, if you will, discount rates to be low? Okay, so it's no longer the case that everything goes on forever. Okay, so I'm going to couch my attempt to forecast cap rates using this dynamic Gordon model. Okay, so I'm going to sort of put the traditional Gordon model aside and work with this dynamic Gordon model. Okay, so how do you sort of, if you will, implement this dynamic Gordon model? Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about something called a vector autoregression. Okay, but again, I'll try to sort of make this as intuitive as possible. So ask yourself the question, well, how are we going to forecast these cap rates? What information do we need? Well, certainly I want to use cap rates themselves, because hopefully past cap rates say something about future cap rates. Long-term treasury rates should be important, and NOI growth should be important as well. So what I end up doing is I stack those, okay, into a vector. So that's the V in vector autoregression. And then you sort of say, well, how do these variables move through time? Right? I need to sort of give it some dynamics, okay, if I'm worrying about time variation. Well, the traditional approach is to say, well, let's do an autoregressive specification that, if you will, if we call this the state variable today, right, that depends on the state variable last period, okay? And so putting everything together, you get a vector autoregression, okay? And anyway, so the idea here is, so I've got the cap rate today depends on the cap rate yesterday, the treasury rate yesterday, the growth in NOI yesterday, okay? But notice that this relationship is fixed, right? So how, if you will, treasury rates, say last quarter impacted cap rates today, that always stays fixed. That relationship can't vary. So, but I thought, well, what if these relationships do vary over time? You know, what if how past treasury rates impact today's cap rate differs over time? You know, maybe, you know, how that relationship was couched prior to COVID might be different, say, post-COVID, or might that relationship prior to the financial crisis be different post the financial crisis? So I'm going sort of one step beyond sort of the traditional vector autoregression specification. I want to ask, what if these relationships between cap rates and treasury rates and growth rates, what if those relationships do vary over time themselves? How are we going to sort of take that into account when we do our forecasting exercise? And this is where neural networks come into play, because we're going to use sort of a neural network model to forecast this time-varying relationship, okay? So here, okay, when I say recall, so I'm sort of saying, well, go back to your graduate student days, and I'm sure going to Bill Wheaton's classes, I'm sure you saw many, many linear regression models in your life, okay? And I'm interested in sort of, to begin with, sort of what would be called the cross-sectional linear regression model. So for example, what's the relationship between, say, the value of a property and its size measured in square feet, okay? Well, we can always estimate that using linear regression. And you probably have at least at one point in at least your student days, if not later, okay? Now today, when people perform a linear regression, it's literally some command in Excel. But if you were to step back, and this is sort of important to understand what these neural network models do, right? Well, you can think of, as I try to be writing there, you can think of a linear regression problem saying, well, look, I've got a loss function that I want to make as small as possible. And that's the sum of squared errors between the actual value that I'm predicting and the model, okay? And the idea is that you can couch that problem saying, well, you can apply some sort of numerical method like gradient descent to sort of minimize that loss function, which means, well, let's use some numerical technique to learn about those parameters that sort of, characterize that linear regression, okay? And that's in some sense what neural network models do. But neural network models are on a far larger scale, okay? So instead of sort of learning about 3 or 4 parameters of a linear regression model, in these neural networks, right, basically there are millions, if not billions, of weights and biases associated with these little neurons. But the whole idea is that you're going to use some simple numerical procedure like gradient descent to optimize those parameters, to learn about those parameters, so that they activate these neurons in such a way that at the end, the loss function is minimized, just like linear regression. So instead of 2 or 3 parameters, we've got millions of parameters, okay? But the problem is with traditional neural network models is they can't handle time series data or sequential data because they have no memory, okay? And okay, so this picture you'll see in my talk here today, I'm working with, the only data that I have is the NCREIF NPI index. But the point I want to emphasize here is that, there are little sort of high frequency movements in this data, but on the whole, it's fairly a smooth series. There's persistence, which means to say you can probably use past values to forecast future values. And that's a problem with traditional neural network models because they lack memory. And in fact, the VAR model is recurrent. And so the idea is that the definition of the state variable at t depends on the same definition of time t minus 1, which means the state at time 3 depends on the state at time 2, but the state at time 2 depends on the state at time 1, or the state at time 10 at the end will depend on the state at time 1. And you get what's referred to as long-term dependence. And that's a real problem in these models because that means that these gradients that sort of are used to guide the algorithms to sort of minimize, the gradients go to 0, they vanish. You have no more guidance. Or alternatively, it blows up the model, okay? So that's why what we're going to use is, if you will, a recurrent neural network which basically includes a feedback loop. So it's not feed forward, it's a feedback model. And again, what does deep learning mean? Well, it just says, hey, break a complex problem into many smaller, simpler tasks. And that's what we're going to do. So I just have one last slide, really. Very preliminary results. And they're preliminary because, you know, I need more data. So I'm looking to the alumni to provide more data so that we can sort of explore these sorts of issues. So again, with Richard's help, we fit a deep time-varying VAR model using a particular sort of recurrent neural network. And the idea is very simply put, we said, hey, let's fit this. We take data on the NACREIF NPI index, fit the model, say, for 10 years, then use it to forecast out 20 quarters. And then we do this rolling window approach where we take that original 10-year period, move it forward say one quarter, repeat. So we end up with multiple 1 quarter forecasts, 2 quarter forecasts, all the way out to 20 quarter forecasts. And what I tabulate here are the mean squared errors. So you see, we do fairly well. So that's just the square difference between the actual and predicted. We do fairly well at 1 quarter, but, you know, by 8 quarters, you know, we're an order of magnitude worse. And then as we progressively get further and further out, you know, again, we don't do so well, okay? But again, my concluding remark is, you know, almost it's almost like from Oliver Twist, just more data, please. I mean, we really, you know, again, we've developed this model, you know, it's difficult to optimize, but it seems to work. And it would be really great, you know, if we could get more data from you. And, you know, but again, data is so important to train these models. And you know, one of the issues I've always found with real estate finance research is lack of data. But so please, you know, I'd really appreciate any data, any suggestions for ideas with you know, using this algorithm, et cetera. All right, thank you.